These days you're encouraged to have PowerPoint or computers of some sort, and my university keeps trying to pressure me to put courses online and to use PowerPoint in my classroom, and I keep telling them, no, I'm a troglodyte, I'm an old-fashioned chalk and talk professor. And then they took away my chalk and gave me these, okay? So no longer am I even allowed chalk. Okay, well, thanks everybody for showing up for the grim but fascinating topic of the problem of evil. I did a little paper here called A Simple Statement of a Problem of Evil, and I'll be happy to send anybody a copy of it if you want one by email attachment, something like that. But I'm just going to summarize it basically here. Okay, what's the basis for the problem of evil? What is the foundation for it? The foundation is that theists, traditional theism has a certain conception of God. That is, there are certain ideas about God which are not up for grabs. They are not things that we can dispense with. That is, God must be conceived as omnipotent. That is, all-powerful. What does all-powerful mean? All-powerful means that God can do anything except make a contradiction true. God cannot make an odd number evenly divisible by 2. God cannot make a married bachelor, okay? He cannot do those things because for those things to exist, a self-contradiction would have to be true. And so theologians have generally said that God can do anything that does not entail a contradiction, okay? All right, anything else God can do. God can part the sea. He can heal the sick. He can allow you to walk on water or feed thousands with a McDonald's Happy Meal, okay? Any of this stuff God can do because doing those things, though miraculous, does not entail a self-contradiction, okay? So God is all-powerful. He is omnipotent, all right? Furthermore, God is perfectly good. Not just kind of good, like the Greek gods. You know, the Greek gods are kind of good. They're kind of awful, too, okay? But not just kind of good, not just real good, okay? Not just citizen of the year good, but perfectly good, okay? Perfectly good. God is as good can be. Furthermore, God is the creator of all things, visible and invisible, as the old creeds used to say. I love that, okay? Visible and invisible. Creator of all things, does that mean that God is the creator even of evil things? Directly or indirectly, yes, he must be. God creates directly, as you know, when he says, as in the book of Genesis, let there be, and it is so, okay? All God has to do is say, let there be birds, and there are birds in the air, okay? He creates indirectly when he creates, for instance, natural systems with natural laws, and the impersonal working of those natural laws then is allowed to create or bring into existence new entities of various sorts. For instance, if God created the laws of evolution, then evolution becomes the secondary cause whereby God creates all of the diversity of life on earth. A second way that God creates, indirectly, is by creating beings like you and me, endowed with sentience and intelligence, well, except for Washington, D.C., okay? Sorry, okay, endowed with sentience and intelligence and given freedom to create things that we want to create, okay? For instance, whoever first invented the wheel, God gets part of the credit for that because God created that person, gave that person intelligence, creativity, and therefore God gets partial credit for inventions from the wheel to the iPad, okay? So that's it. However, the downside of it is this. Nature and human beings, sentient creatures, often bring about truly terrible things. In nature, for instance, we see that the impersonal workings of the laws of nature bring about things such as dreadful tsunamis, explosive volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, tornadoes, diseases of all sorts, viral diseases, some of which are, excruciatingly horrible and terrible, okay? The most frightening book I've ever read is one by a fellow named John Preston called The Hot Zone. Anybody ever read The Hot Zone? Okay, all right. The Hot Zone, most frightening book I've ever read, because it talks about these emerging viruses, hemorrhagic fever, nasty stuff, okay? All right, so human beings and nature bring about terrible things. Humans, of course, do awful things. We commit holocausts and genocide and small-scale murders and rape and child abuse and all sorts of lies, deceit, and treachery, and politicians all the time, okay? Things like that, that's my second dig on politicians. Okay, last one today. All right, so that's it. We do these terrible things all the time, okay? So, in a way then, isn't God responsible, or hasn't God created all those terrible things, at least indirectly? And the answer, of course, has got to be yes. Okay, well, since God is all-powerful, that means he can prevent any evil. Since God is perfectly good, of course, it appears prima facie that he would want to prevent evil. And since he is the creator, he is responsible for all the evils, okay, that actually exist. And we know that many actually exist. Recognizing these things led the Greek philosopher Epicurus, about 300 years BCE, to propose the following problem. Epicurus says, well, look, these three things seem to be undeniably true, okay, according to our standard conception of God. God is all-powerful, number one. Number two, God is perfectly good, okay. Number three, God does not prevent the existence of natural and moral evil, okay. God does not prevent the existence of natural and moral evil. Okay, I didn't want to read, but since this next paragraph, I want to make sure I get the wording correctly. Let me read this short paragraph to you. Yet, as the Greek philosopher Epicurus observed long ago, these three claims seemingly form an inconsistent set. That is, any two of them could be true, but all three of them cannot. Okay? His reasoning was this. If God can prevent evil, then, if he is perfectly good, he does prevent evil. If God is all-powerful, then he can prevent evil. Yet God does not prevent evil. So we must conclude that either God is not perfectly good or not all-powerful, okay? And that reasoning is easily translatable into propositional logic and easily proven valid, okay? Well, it seems then we are confronted with a conclusion that is a disjunction. Either God is not perfectly good or he is not all-powerful. Which of these do we give up? But for traditional theism, the theism embodied in the traditional creeds of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, neither is an option. You can't give up either. So what do we do? Well, the only option, if you have a valid argument, as I'm sure you've been taught in basic logic class here, the only option if you have a valid argument is to go back and question one of the premises, okay? Well, the premise here that may be shaky is this. Will God prevent evil, okay? Will he prevent all evil? Might it not be, in fact, that God might have a morally sufficient reason for permitting the terrible things that occur? Might it not be that God would have a morally sufficient reason so that he can be excused? He would have legitimate excuses for permitting the terrible things, okay? Well, to get clear on the idea of a morally sufficient reason, a morally sufficient reason for a perfectly good being to permit evils, we need to get a little bit clearer on this notion of what a perfectly good being would be. What would it be to be perfectly good? Well, let's start then with the notion of a good parent, let's say, a good parent. A good parent, won't she protect her children from suffering as long as she can, and as long it is a good thing to prevent that suffering? There are occasions in which even a very good parent, a perfectly good parent, might allow her children to suffer certain things. For instance, perhaps some suffering is necessary, some evil is necessary to prevent even greater evils. For instance, a clear example would be something like this. I'm sure you all remember as kids when you had to go to the doctor and get shots, right? one of your favorite memories from childhood. I remember as a kid going to my pediatrician and having to sit outside trying to bury my nose in the latest edition of the Saturday Evening Post, while the kids ahead of me were all down at the nurses' station screaming their heads off, okay? I would sit out there trying to keep up my morale while the sounds of a medieval torture chamber would be wafting from the back, okay? I would hear pleas, prayers, confessions, all sorts of things coming from the back, okay? So it was a bad thing. Why did your mother, who was a good mother, permit you to get these nasty shots? Because, for instance, typhoid and tetanus and all that stuff are even worse, okay? On the other hand, a perfectly good mother will allow her children to undergo something unpleasant, even painful, if it is necessary for the achievement of some good that is so great that that good makes worthwhile, that good, we might say, redeems the evil, okay? For instance, you remember algebra, okay? Did anybody in here honestly enjoy dividing polynomials, okay? Okay, no, you're... I'll have to admit, I tried recently to go back and revive my long-forgotten knowledge of algebra, and when I got to dividing polynomials by polynomials, I stopped because I decided I would rather walk barefoot over broken glass than do this, okay? All right, but why then do your parents, if they're good parents, insist that you do your algebra homework? Because homework, even when tedious, is necessary to get an education, and an education is a great enough good to justify the tedium of homework, okay? All right then, all right. So I think then that we can say about God, as opposed to a human parent, with a human parent, remember once again, no matter how diligent, no matter how hard he or she tries, they will not be able to prevent you from suffering some things, from suffering some evils. God, on the other hand, unlike a human parent, is unavoidably, necessarily, by definition, all-powerful, and therefore can prevent any evil whatsoever, okay? Therefore, we can say that God will only allow an evil to occur if God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing that evil. That is, if that evil is necessary, and necessary even for God, right? Necessary even for God. If that evil is necessary to prevent a worse evil or to achieve some good that is so great, it makes the necessary evils worthwhile. Is that okay? Follow? All right? Okay, good. All right. So therefore, I think we can say that the following principle P must be true, and I would not be a philosopher if I didn't give you some principles P and Q that you had to memorize, so I apologize for that, okay? All right, principle P. If God exists, then for every evil E, if E is an actual evil, and by actual evil I mean all past, present, and future evils that actually occur, okay? If God exists, then for every evil E, if E is an actual evil, then God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting E. I think P, principle P, is a necessary truth if we accept the standard definition of the theistic God. It must be the case that for any evil that is actual, any evil that actually exists, God would not permit it unless God had a morally sufficient reason for permitting E. That is, unless it were necessary to prevent greater evil or to achieve a justifying, redeeming good. Okay? We can say that. Principle P is put in the form of a conditional, a hypothetical or conditional statement. Let us separate out the consequent of that statement and call it principle Q. Okay, principle Q. For every evil E, if E is an actual evil, then God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting E. Further, I'm going to read just a small amount here. Further, let's define a gratuitous evil. Let's define a gratuitous evil as an evil that not even God would have a morally sufficient reason for permitting. Such an evil is neither necessary to prevent a greater evil, nor necessary to achieve a good great enough to make worthwhile the occurrence of that evil. Hence, if an evil is gratuitous, then God, if he exists, will not permit that evil to become an actual evil. Conversely, if any actual evil is a gratuitous evil, then God does not exist. The crux of the problem of evil, therefore, is whether any actual evils are gratuitous evils. Okay, I see that as the crux of the problem of evil. Are any actual evils gratuitous evils? Furthermore, when we look around the world, there are myriad, innumerable examples of ostensibly, that is, apparently, gratuitous evils. Okay, there are evils which, so far as we can tell, using our intelligence and knowledge to the best of our ability, these evils appear to be gratuitous. That is, either they are so horrendously awful that nothing would seem to justify them. Nothing in our experience could possibly justify the occurrence of such horrendous evils, or they seem so purposeless and so avoidable and absolutely senseless that many of them, even humans, had they been at the right place in the right time, could have avoided. So certainly an all-powerful God could, right? Okay. And there seem to be innumerable examples of such gratuitous evils. To take an example, okay, consider, this is the philosopher William Rowe, University of Purdue, often uses an example very much like this. Imagine a forest fire started by lightning, okay? And it burns thousands of acres furiously, okay? In the process of doing so, it will terrify and then horribly, painfully kill many innocent forest creatures, many innocent animals, okay? Animals, of course, are free of sin. They do not deserve the pains they suffer, okay? There's no such thing as punishing them for doing the wrong thing. So they have unwanted, undeserved pain in this circumstance. Now, could not an all-powerful being find some way to accomplish whatever good is accomplished by burning a forest without subjecting its denizens periodically to terrible, frightening, and painful deaths? They tell us that we humans should let some forests burn because naturally they do burn, and so maybe God should let them burn too. But don't forget, God is not restricted by the limitations we have. Maybe we as stewards of the earth, and with the limitations we have, should let some forests burn. But surely God is much smarter than us, much more powerful than us, and surely therefore it seems that such incidents are such that God could preserve the health of the forest without hideously killing the denizens of that forest, seemingly. Well, this, of course, is just one of innumerable examples that we could adduce. This is known as the evidential version of the problem of evil. And again, in a nutshell, it goes like this. There are so many apparently prima facie instances of gratuitous evil in the world, so many of them, overwhelming numbers, that surely that is evidence that some of these apparently gratuitous evils must, in fact, be actually gratuitous. Okay, that is standard version of the evidential argument from evil. Now, often the standard reply to this is to reply as Professor William Lane Craig, a famous Christian philosopher, did in debating the problem of evil with me at one time, is to give the following answer. And again, for accuracy's sake, I will quote verbatim Professor Craig, okay? We aren't in a good position to assess with confidence the probability or improbability of whether God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting bad things. Suffering that appears utterly pointless within our limited framework may be seen to be justly permitted in God's wider framework. The brutal murder of a child may have a ripple effect through history, such that God's reason for not preventing that evil may emerge only centuries later or in another country. In other words, Professor Craig is saying that we have so little understanding, such an inadequate understanding of the nature of omnipotence, of the power of being all-powerful, that we are not in a position epistemologically speaking. We are not in the epistemological position of being able to competently judge that God could not bring forth some inconceivable good to justify even the worst, most horrendous evils. You know, the most horrendous evils of all. After all, Scripture says, at some point, Scripture says that the eye of man, 1 Corinthians 2:9, as it is written, eye hath not seen nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. So therefore, there may be inconceivable goods that God could create, and we don't know that he couldn't. Again, from our perspective, nothing would count. Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist, in a famous passage in the great novel The Brothers Karamazov, he has his character Ivan put it to his brother Aloysia, who's planning to be a monk. He puts it this way. He says, if you could create a paradise filled with myriads of happy and virtuous creatures, yet the price of that paradise was to have hideously tortured to death one innocent small child, would you do it? I think our instincts rebel against that. Our instincts rebel against it. Yet the fact of the matter is that in our world, this very world that we're living in today, on this very day, literally tens of thousands of small children have died around the world painfully in dire circumstances this very day, right now, while we're talking. Okay, it is happening. It is simply impossible for us to even imagine a good great enough to justify such dire suffering, okay? Yet, Professor Craig says, maybe, someday, somewhere, somehow, God could redeem even this dreadful suffering, though we can't say how, okay? All right, I'll play along. Maybe, or maybe not. You might say maybe not, back to it. Maybe there simply is no good, not even one realizable by an all-powerful being, which is good enough to redeem the grossest and most disgusting evils. Maybe nothing is. On the other hand, remember, folks, and I hate to keep harping on this, and I don't want people to think I'm talking down. Remember, God is supposed to be a pretty smart and powerful fella, okay? Maybe he could bring about good, an equivalent amount of good, without quite so much evil. Couldn't we have done with maybe just one or two fewer children dying in the world today? Maybe, okay. Could be, all right? So, Craig says maybe he could. I say maybe he couldn't. If Craig is right, then it looks as though all of us, theists and atheists alike, are in a position of agnosticism with respect to Proposition Q, okay? With respect to my Proposition Q, the claim that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting all of the evils that occur. We appear all to be in a position, as Professor Craig says, not to be able to assess the probability or the improbability that Q is true. But if we all, theists and atheists alike, are in a position of agnosticism about that proposition, are we not also necessarily, unavoidably, logically in a position of agnosticism about the existence of God? Indeed, we seem to be in a position of not even being able to say whether God even could exist, okay? Consider a parallel. Could koalas exist in the wild in the state of Texas? Well, koalas can exist only if there is a healthy supply of eucalyptus trees, because koalas only eat eucalyptus, okay? So, a necessary condition for koalas to be able to exist is that there must be eucalyptus trees growing in Texas. So, if I have no information one way or the other about whether eucalyptus trees can grow in Texas, I can have no information one way or the other about whether koalas can live in the wild in Texas, right? Okay? So therefore, if I can have no information one way or the other, as Professor Craig appears to be asserting, whether it is probable or improbable that an all-powerful, perfectly good being would have a morally sufficient reason for permitting apparently gratuitous evils, then I'm in exactly the same situation as I am with koalas. I can't say with any assurance that God either can or cannot exist. Okay, so that seems to be the situation we're in. We seem to be stuck. The problem of evil seems to land us back in the middle of agnosticism at best. Well, maybe someone will say, but wait a second, Parsons, and Professor Craig does say something like this. Maybe we can have independent evidence for the existence of God. That is, maybe independent arguments can establish the existence of God, and therefore, since independent arguments can establish the existence of God, we can know that God exists, and therefore there must be a solution to the problem of evil, even if we don't know what it is. Problem with that is this. You take a look at the standard arguments of natural theology, the attempt to provide support, logical support for the existence of God. Now, the being that these various arguments argue for, the being it are, is something like a fine-tuner who fine-tuned the basic constants of physics so that, marvelous creatures such as us may inhabit this universe, okay? Or a being who is an intelligent designer. The intelligent design movement says that there must be some sort of vague intelligent designer, or maybe a cosmic Kickstarter who started the whole thing off, as Professor Craig argues in his Kalam argument, something such as that. Problem is this. All of those arguments leave aside the moral aspects or the moral predicates of this alleged cosmic Kickstarter, fine-tuner, etc. And it is precisely those moral characteristics that the problem of evil challenges. And until those moral characteristics are established, it will do the theist no good at all to establish a fine-tuner who could be an evil fine-tuner for all we know, who has created sentient beings like us to have the pleasure of torturing, maybe. Okay, all right, that could be what he has done. And until we know that the moral characteristics are supported, the arguments of natural theology does no good whatsoever, okay? All right. Let me skip ahead here. I notice I've got about, 5 more minutes? Okay, good. All right, now I'll be going ahead here. Okay, so it seems then that if the appeals to unknown purposes serve to block the atheist evidential argument from evil, such appeals, as we have seen, have a severe drawback. The unknowability of God's putative purposes in permitting gross evils extends to theists just as much as to atheists. Therefore, it seems to be a weapon that is more dangerous to the person using it than to the target that weapon is aimed at, okay? So I think that the unknown purpose defense is the most powerful weapon that theists have in dealing with the evidential problem of evil. I think it is, in fact, the only one which seems to come close to doing the job. Yet I think that even if we concede the basic claim of the unknown purpose defense, even if we concede it, theists are still arguing against very long odds. And let me tell you why, okay? How long have we had pain and suffering in the cosmos, in the world? Well, on our Earth, at least far back into the Paleozoic, okay? The first creatures to be able to experience, who were neurologically advanced enough to experience pain and suffering, may go back to the Cambrian period. Maybe even trilobites or whatnot were sufficiently neurologically advanced to experience pain and suffering. So pain and suffering has been around for hundreds of millions of years. In all that time, how many incidents have there been of undeserved, unwanted, dire suffering? It seems to me an entirely reasonable figure to postulate that there have been at least 1 trillion, 10 to the 12th incidents of such dire suffering. Well, if that is the case, notice that the theist must hold that none, not one, my friends, not one of those could have been an instance of gratuitous suffering. God must have a morally sufficient reason for permitting all 1 trillion incidents of suffering. Why, if a brontosaurus skinned its knee unnecessarily in the Jurassic, God does not exist. Because a perfectly good being will not permit any unneeded, unnecessary, unjustified suffering, right? So if a single dinosaur suffered unnecessarily, God does not exist. Follows? Absolutely, okay? So, therefore, theists must have an enormous degree of confidence that no incidents of undeserved, unwanted, dire suffering are gratuitous. On what possible rational basis could one place such an enormous degree of confidence? They must consider, in fact, that the probability, and we're talking personal probabilities here, Bayesian, that sort of thing, okay, personal probabilities, their view of the personal probability that they have for each individual incident of that suffering being gratuitous must be infinitesimal, must be very small, or the disjunction of all those probabilities would add up to a very high number. Remember from your basic probability that the disjunction of probabilities is figured by adding them all up, okay? So the disjunction must then be extremely high. Unless we assign a very low, almost infinitesimal order of probability to any individual evil that it is, in fact, gratuitous, okay? All right, so that being the case, it looks as though, even if we concede the main point of the unknown purpose defense, theists are arguing against extremely long odds, okay? Well, some theists, and just to conclude here, some theists have said, well, Parsons, we have in fact explained why God permits evils. That is, we have offered explanations which are called theodicies. A theodicy is an attempt to explain the ways of God to man, to say why God permits such terrible, horrendous evils, to explain why, in fact, these actually occur. Now, many of these are quite ingenious. Some of them are not. Many of them are quite wonderful. But the final word, I think, on theodicies was given by a Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, and I will just conclude by reading a quote from Professor Plantinga. Many consider to be the leading Christian philosopher today, some of us in this room have actually directly confronted him about one thing or another, okay? Very brilliant man. Let me quote from Professor Plantinga, okay? Why does God permit all this evil, and evil of these horrifying kinds in the world? How can they be seen as fitting in with his loving and providential care for his creatures? The Christian must concede he does not know. That is, he doesn't know in any detail. On a quite general level, he may know that God permits evil because he can achieve a world he sees as better by permitting evil than by preventing it. And what God sees as better is, of course, better. But we cannot see why our world, with all its ills, would be better than others we think we can imagine, or what in any detail is God's reason for permitting a given specific and appalling evil. Not only can we not see this, we can't think of any very good possibilities. And here I must say that most attempts to explain why God permits evil, theodicies as they are called, strike me as tepid, shallow, and ultimately frivolous. Couldn't have said it better myself. Does evil provide us with an opportunity for spiritual growth so that this world can be seen as a veil of soul-making? Perhaps some evils can be seen this way. But much leads not to growth, but to apparent spiritual disaster. Is it suggested that the existence of evil provides the opportunity for such goods as the display of mercy, sympathy, self-sacrifice, and the service of others? Again, no doubt some evil can be seen this way, but much evil seems to elicit cruelty rather than sacrificial love. And neither of these suggestions, I think, takes with sufficient seriousness the sheer hideousness of which some of the these evils, of some of the evils we see. Okay, again, I think very good. So I just conclude one short paragraph. So Plantinga thinks that Christians should admit that they do not know why God permits evil. He thinks that, despite this, Christians can still have confidence that God does have good reason for permitting evil. But how? How? How do we penetrate the wall of imponderables raised by Craig and other defenders of the unknown purpose defense? If the capacities and opportunities of omnipotence are unknown, then they are unknown. Tautology, but I think it has some point. None of us can say with any confidence whether God probably does or does not have good reasons for permitting evils. So be it. In that case, none of us can say with any confidence that God exists. Thank you very much.
Now, Professor Humican is going to present his presentation, and then after there'll be exchange.